All right. Well, hello, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I get to introduce this week's speakers, two colleagues that have joined us from the Center for Global Trade Analysis at the University of Purdue, Doctors Dominique Mensbrugghe and Maksym Chepliev. Both are well-known experts in economic analysis and policymaking. They work on a range of different topics from environment, climate, agricultural policy, and trade policy, and are really kind of at the cutting edge in terms of using economic models to help improve evidence-based decision-making. To give a little bit more context in terms of the institute that they work at, they're coming from the Global Trade Analysis Center at the University of Purdue, and this is a really critical global consortium that has been really important in the forefront of developing economic models and curating the data that is sort of key for using these types of tools. It's also been one of the most important institutes in terms of advancing the use of economic models globally. It was founded in the early 90s and is supported by international institutions like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the European Commission, and is really, I think, one of the key institutions in terms of trying to use economic models to do more in terms of trying to inform improved policymaking. And today they're going to be telling us a bit of the work that they've been doing in terms of thinking about how do we simulate the economy and the agriculture sector with these types of tools to consider how to achieve food security within a world of resource scarcity and limited political capital. And so with great pleasure, I'd like to welcome both of them up here and give them the floor.
Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I was a grad student in the 80s, and I was very influenced by the work of Cornell researchers at the time, particularly Eric Thorbecke. You should look him up if you don't know of him. I understand he's still with us. He's 96 years old. It would be great to see him. But I've been following work from people here at Cornell for very many years. Since we don't have much time, I'm going to go ahead with the talk. I'm going to kind of give the main motivation for what we're trying to do. As Daniel says, we're trying to think about food, how we project it ahead in the future, and what kind of policies we would implement to have a more sustainable, both more sustainable diets and a more sustainable planet. So that's kind of the objectives of where we're going. In terms of motivation, we start with the fact that, the world has done actually a really good job on average from, this shows you the per capita caloric intake across broad regions for the last 25 years, more or less. So sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, North Africa, Latin America, Europe, East Asia, and North America. And you could see at the world level, over the last 25 years, we're now roughly at 3,000 kilocalories per day. For those of you who aren't familiar with the statistics, the body needs roughly 1,850 per day to that's at rest, so without doing any work or anything like that. So we're well above the minimum. And you can see there's been broad progress, but, it's uneven regionally. So some regions are still lagging far behind. Of course, it's very uneven within regions as well. So that's I'll get to that in a second. So this overall positive picture comes from just tremendous productivity in agriculture, all right? So you can see here globally that the population from 1960 to today has gone from 3 billion to 8 billion, to an increase of 5 billion people, a huge increase in the number of people. The amount of land that's been devoted to cropland, not agriculture, but cropland, has increased marginally, all right? So roughly 35%. So the orange line is the amount of land per person, and you can see that has gone down dramatically since the 1960s. So that's just productivity. And we've seen as well a massive migration out from farm activities into manufacturing and services. And this has been roughly globally true. Now, getting to the negative side of that picture, well, on the blue bars here are the percentage of undernourished, and the orange bars are the number that are overnourished, so that the rate of obesity. And you can see that the percentage of undernourished is still quite high, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, at over 20%. At the global level, it's been hovering around 8-9% for a very long time. But the level of obesity has gone up dramatically. In North America in particular, it's at 40%, but it's high as well in regions that have lots of undernourishment. So we call this the dual burden. The other problem that has arisen from this overall positive picture, of course, is the environmental picture. So direct agriculture, the emissions, the direct emissions from agriculture production is roughly 13% of greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that that's roughly 6 gigatons relative to the rest of the economy, which is just under 45 gigatons. And here we show a breakout of the source of those emissions. So you can see in agriculture, a lot of it's coming from methane, that's CH4. So that's essentially from livestock, but also nitrous oxides is another big part. And then you also get methane emissions from rice as well. Okay, so now you might have heard statistics that food is 20 or 24% of emissions, because this is just direct emissions from production itself. But then you have the whole supply chain of food, which also is linked to emissions, right? You need transportation, you need energy and manufacturing, you need cooking, storage, et cetera. And the other very important part of agricultural emissions are induced land use emissions. As agriculture has expanded, it's led to deforestation, and therefore quite a rise in emissions coming from that. We're not quantifying that here. All right, so that's the motivation for this talk. So we're projecting food forward to 2050, 2060. We can see that overall that's a good thing for the population, but that there are associated bads with that as well. So how do we quantify food demand? This is where it's going to get a little bit technical, and I apologize to those of you who it might go a little bit over your head, but I'll try and be pretty simple in the explanation. So there are two traditions. So one is what we call partial equilibrium modeling. So the way we think about food demand in that case, so C is demand or consumption. I is the commodity. It could be beef, it could be rice, wheat, whatever. H is a household, and it could be very micro-oriented, or H could be a country, right? Where this equation is kind of agnostic about what H is, and T is for time, all right? So the two main determinants of food demand are income, so that's Y, okay? And we have an elasticity there. So the elasticity tells you what's the sensitivity of food demand relative to your income, and you have the price, all right? And it's a big issue, for example, in the US right now, this whole issue about affordability. Egg prices are too high, so you would expect food demand to go down as prices increase. And then I have this function F here, and we have other prices may matter as well, all right? If you're thinking about buying beef, well, maybe the price of chicken is relevant in that case, okay? So, but this is just kind of a generic equation. Now, the parametrization, can depend on many, many things, all right? So even though this is a relatively simple equations, those alphas and etas and epsilons and stuff like that, they could depend on many characteristics, okay? Gender, age, beliefs. In India, they don't eat much beef for religious reason, location, My wife's from Colombia. We eat a lot of tropical fruits there for obvious reasons. So those parameters are based on many different factors. And the nice thing about this equation is there's a lot of international data that lets you estimate these parameters and do your projections. Daniel has done most of his career doing that with the impact model. I did some of that when I was at the FAO. All right. The weakness is not linked to what we consider consistent demand systems. If you take, Econ 101, this comes from utility maximization. You got constraints and stuff like that. So now, what we're trying to get at in this talk as well, and this is one of the strengths, we're trying to understand what are the calories associated with this demand. Because we're trying to project calories. We're not trying to project, tons of wheat consumed or anything like that. And with this equation, it's really easy because you know that per ton of wheat, you have X amount of calories. All right. So it's pretty easy to project calories once you have this equation here. Now let me get you something much more complicated, all right? So, and this is what I do. I do general equilibrium modeling. So what do households do? They maximize utility subject to a budget constraint, okay? And so kind of the two demand systems that are very frequently used in general equilibrium modeling, one is called the linear expenditure system, the LES, all right? And it takes that form. I'm not going to go into the details here. And the one that's associated with GTAP is the CDE, constant difference in elasticity, a lot messier, but it has some nice features which is one reason why we use. So the strengths consistent with demand theory, they're true income constraints. So if you eat less beef, you're going to buy more of something else. In the partial equilibrium model, you don't have that. All right. Those equations are independent. There might be some cross-price relations there, but basically they're independent. In a general equilibrium, everything depends on everything. All right. And that's a really nice, I go to conferences with people who don't think in a general equilibrium sense. They go, people should eat less. And I go, okay. And why should they eat less? Because less emissions. I go, yeah, but what are they going to buy if they eat less? It might be more emissions, all right? And they don't think about that. But when you're in a general equilibrium framework, you're always thinking about spillover effects, okay? So that's really one of the strengths. It's a full demand system, but that's also a potential weakness because you need a lot of information, okay? When you're in a partial equilibrium framework, all you need to know is demand for each food category. When you have a full demand system, you have to know what demand for everything, okay? The other big weakness from the point of view of tracking calories, and this is so Maksym's going to tell you how we do it, is that in our system, people are not eating wheat, all right? They're eating pasta. They're eating cornflakes. They're eating bread, stuff like that. So in our demand system, what we know is how much bread they're buying. We don't know how much wheat is in there, okay, or other foods. So it's really, really hard to track for us calories. And I'll just show you, this is my last slide before I get the floor to Maksym. If you look at the GTAP database and you look at the consumer demand, the budget of a consumer in our system, okay? So they're spending on agricultural commodities, on food commodities, manufacturing, services, and everything like that. If you just add up all the things they spend on food, okay, and then this is the percentage of the food budget that is spent on what we call agricultural commodities. So in the case of India, almost 50% of the expenditures on food is to buy agricultural commodities, rice, whatever they're buying, okay? But you look at the other end of the income spectrum, USA, Argentina, Canada, for example, and only 10% of the food budget on average in those countries is spent on agricultural products. The rest is spent on processed foods. And it's really hard to know what calories are in processed foods. Okay? So Maksym's just going to go through how we try and back out what the caloric content is of the average household food budget. Okay? So, Maksym.
Thank you, Dominique. Okay, so in terms of kind of the way how we try to address this issue in their in our modeling frameworks and why in general it is important. So as Dominique mentioned, this direct food consumption in many cases represents, you know, a relatively small share from your total food expenditure. And when we look at the economic data, we find that post-farm gate value chain, so essentially, you know, the food you buy at the restaurants, you know, in grocery stores, they in many cases represent over 80% of the total food expenditures. There are also, as Dominique has already highlighted, major interactions between agri-food system itself and, you know, both upstream and downstream sectors. So for instance, think of fertilizers or, you know, service sectors like restaurants. So it's important. This context is really important. And finally, you know, there are many important policy interactions. So think of you implement specific policies in the food sector, how it would impact household income, right? Or you implement some economy-wide policies, for instance, trade policies, how that would impact the agri-food sector, or you know, how climate change or climate policies, for that matter. So at the same time, you know, some challenges in addition to what Dominique has highlighted, it's really hard to understand what is the share of food is consumed out of home, because that's not directly observed, right? So what we have in the data, we know how much people spend, let's say, when they go to the restaurant, but what is the composition of the food they buy there, right? What is the share of kind of services versus the food itself? So essentially, this explicit tracking from, you know, farm to table, or to fork, which occurs not only when you go to the grocery store, but also when you buy food in their, I don't know, in the hotel, right, or school lunches and so on. It's really complicated. And finally, there are also non-food categories like feed, seed, losses, waste, right, which need to be accounted for. And then in many cases, the supply chains are very distributed. So you might be growing wheat in one country, then you export it to another country, you produce a flour there, and then you export it to third country where the bake is bread, which you buy in the restaurant, right? So this kind of like geographical distribution is also like a major kind of aspect that we need to represent. So with this, and I won't be going through details, but it's just to represent kind of how relatively complex our procedures are when we try to reconcile all the data together, right? So we do use, you know, Food and Agriculture Association, FAO data to come up with some initial inputs. But then the major issue is to reconcile the economic flows with nutritional flows, right? Because, you know, what is the price of calorie across different composition of food supplies, right? In terms of geographical distribution and so on. So when we assume one-to-one mapping between, for instance, calories and economic flows, it doesn't work. So we have to kind of like implement adjustment at every kind of tracing stage to come up with some reasonable numbers along their supply chain. So you can also represent it in a more kind of this visualized manner where, so these are different flows and steps how we try to trace the food supply, you know, in order to make a consistent representation of their entire supply chains. And then this also captures the geographical distribution. So for instance, we would have different kind of representation where the food has been produced domestically and supplied domestically, where it has been exported, then processed there, and then again exported, right? So at these stages, we kind of apply different processing routines, including some, you know, relatively complex like matrix inversion algorithms to kind of back up the primary content for processed food. So, and then with this, we're able to come up with kind of the database that reconciles nutritional inputs with economic flows. So we can trace, for instance, in terms of the composition of food demand, where is it coming from? Is it direct food consumption, for instance, you know, wheat or rice, you know, veggies, fruits and nuts? Is it consumption through processed food? So I don't know, different food mixes or prepared foods that you buy in the grocery store? Or is it consumption in the restaurants and other service sectors? And we have this composition by countries, by commodities. we also able to explicitly trace foods consumed out of home, right? So, and we know that as income increases, the share of out-of-home food consumption also increases, right? So, for instance, here, we see that in the US, according to survey data, around 34% of your food expenditures are actually on food out of home. So you go to the cafe, you buy coffee there, you go to the restaurant, right? But then when and there is also different composition. So this include, for instance, school lunches, food bought in the hotels, and so on and so forth. And with our procedures, we're able to trace it. And when we compare it with their kind of survey data, in general, we get a pretty good match. So despite all the complications and, kind of these processing steps that we went through. So another important aspect when we try to understand how kind of food supply chains are kind of evolving is understanding their kind of food supply versus net intake. So in other words, understanding what is the food loss and waste, right? And for this, we have also done some recent work with colleagues from Wageningen University, constructing a new global food loss and waste database where we trace food loss and waste across 5 different supply stages, so agricultural production, post-harvest manufacturing, distribution and retail, and consumption in this global kind of economy-wide value chains, right? So we improved their earlier work done by FAO and, did their detailed kind of literature review survey, came up with shares of food loss and waste across different stages, commodities, countries, and then embedded it in the framework that we have. And with this, we can then look, okay, how is the food loss and waste distributed across supply stages, right? So, for instance, this is an overview of the global food loss and waste kind of flows, right, across years, how it does change, for instance, between 2004 and 2014, what have been the largest drivers of changes in food loss and waste. So, for instance, we can decompose historical food loss and waste changes across key kind of driving forces. So, and for instance, in mostly middle-income countries that have experienced pretty rapid economic growth, like China, India, over the last years, an increase in food loss and waste has been driven largely by growth in income, right? So think of when you buy some food, for instance, I don't know, vegetables, fruits, apples, when households have high income, in general, their marginal utility of food kind of declines. So I don't know, you would eat half apple, you would throw it away. So essentially, this income growth kind of persuades more food loss and waste, right? And then we have been also identifying cases where, for instance, population growth, like in sub-Saharan Africa or Middle East, has also driving the food demand and thus increasing food loss and waste. So what we have been kind of discussing so far were more like snapshot of the economy, historical snapshot, right? But then when we try to project how economy would evolve over time and then how food and the agricultural system would evolve over time, there are kind of a number of additional complications like assumptions that we need to make. So then and that's related to the demand system that Dominique has discussed. So when we forecast the food system going forward, we usually make a number of adjustments or refinements, to their model representation or parameterization. So one particular refinement is there's income elasticity, right? So how your food demand would change with your income, right? And that's particularly important because we know that the food is very inelastic, and also like usually, you wouldn't consume more than a specific amount of calories, right? So if your income quadruples over 40 years, it doesn't mean that you would consume 4 times more calories, right? You don't need them. So, but at the same time, many demand system parameterizations, they do not take that into account. So one specific adjustment that we need to make is to properly represent this kind of like relationship between growing income and food consumption. Another important aspect is to understand how kind of their production system and cost structures would evolve over time. So think, for instance, of restaurant, right? So, in low-income country, you might have I don't know, locally owned small cafe, right, with relatively small margins and value added, right, serving mostly some, food from, I don't know, they're locally sourced, right? But then when, economies grow, they become richer, right? You would have like a chain restaurants, more, upscale with high level of value added. So essentially we have to adjust what is kind of in the service sectors, what is the price of the calorie delivered in services, right? So again, with growing incomes, the price of calorie delivered in restaurants kind of increases, right? So and then we adjust for that in our kind of forecast going forward. And finally, we kind of also need to take into account how consumer preferences change over time. And this gets to the point of, as your income grow, you start going more out and consuming food out of home rather than, consuming it directly, or you buy more, for instance, processed food in the grocery stores rather than just, raw ingredients and then cook it. So this is like a preference shift that is linked to, evolution of the economy and growing income. So that's another important aspect that we kind of usually capture. Okay, then I'll finish this presentation with a specific kind of featuring specific application that focuses on interaction between food loss and waste policies, reduction policies, and global dietary shifts. This is a work with colleagues from Wageningen, so with Alessandro, who recently also joined OECD. So a bit of a motivation in terms of understanding the interaction between transitioning to healthier diets and reducing food loss and waste. So in general, there are like mixed evidence of what is the interaction between these two aspects. So healthy diet is usually rather heavy in healthy foods like vegetables, fruits, nuts, and have lower consumption of meat. But at the same time, healthy foods usually have higher rates of food loss and waste because they're perishable, it's hard to transport, to store them. So we know that when people would transition to healthy diet, they would in general consume less, right, in terms of net caloric intakes. But then in terms of the composition, that might shift more towards, more perishable fruits, vegetables that have higher shares of food loss and waste, right? So what we essentially try to do here is to understand what are the interactions between these two aspects. So here we combine all the developments that we have just discussed, right? So food loss and waste database, this nutritional framework for tracing calories along the global supply chains. And then we link it to their specific economic model, which I'll discuss a bit later. So it's a global economic model that kind of links all these kind of things together, imposing different behavioral equations on their on consumers, covering all countries and regions in the world and the entire economy, representing many sectors. So not only agriculture and food, but also services, manufacturing, including restaurants, and so on. So the model is dynamic. So as Dominique mentioned, we usually do this like long-term projection. So here we try to see what will happen by 2050, all right? So over the next 25 years, we have a representation of the entire economy, so grouped into 36 sectors. And then we do implement a number of adjustments in terms of model parameterizations, the ones that I just mentioned. So, and the strength of this framework is that we do capture this economy-wide interactions between agri-food system, the rest of the economy, right? And the global economy in general and throughout their whole supply chains. When we kind of do this type of simulations, we usually try to develop some set of exploratory scenarios because we need to make assumptions how things would evolve over time and also what are their alternative scenarios, so to compare different references. So what we do here, and again, I won't be going into details, but this is just to give you kind of a feel of how many different layers we have when we, in our modeling frameworks, when we try to shape the scenarios, right? So we need to make many assumptions on different aspects, including, how, for instance, climate would evolve over time, how diets would evolve, productivity assumptions, loss and waste assumptions, how economy would grow, how population would change, right? So we have some baseline assumptions, essentially assuming no specific policies are implemented. And then we have alternative scenarios where we either, focus on reducing food loss and waste only, or on so here we assume like halving food loss and waste, 50% reduction based on Sustainable Development Goal targets. And then we have scenarios that implement dietary transition shocks, so where people transition to healthier diets by changing their preferences and changing their consumption patterns. And then we have a combination of both food loss and waste reduction and dietary transition to account kind of for interactions. So we do have a parameterization of what is a healthy diet, right? So which include changes in net intakes across different food groups. So in general, it's overall reduction in caloric intakes, and then increasing share of healthy foods like vegetables, fruits, nuts, and reducing share of animal-based foods, just to simplify things. And then we kind of have a baseline scenario of how this kind of caloric intakes would evolve over time by across countries. Okay, so what are the key takeaways from our scenario analysis? So first, without any specific policy interventions, we find that food loss and waste are expected to rise quite substantially, so around 50% from current levels by 2050, right? And then if we just look at the healthy dietary transition, this doesn't seem to be sufficient to kind of lead to net reduction in food loss and waste. So we still find quite substantial growth. But at the same time, when we combine healthy diet transition with food loss and waste reductions, that does allow to achieve net reduction in food loss and waste compared to their current levels. We also find some important implications for differences in the composition of food loss and waste from two policies. So dietary shifts themselves, they mostly reduce food loss and waste for animal-based foods, so meats, livestock products, because that's where, diets mostly change, and do not impact that much food loss and waste for vegetable, fruits, and in some cases in sub-Saharan Africa might even increase that. At the same time, when we look into food loss and waste reductions, those mostly impact fruits, vegetables, so mostly healthy foods. So essentially the combination of both policies really does interact well in terms of reducing actual food loss and waste volumes. In terms of location, and by location, I mean by different stages of the food supply chain. We also find some interesting interaction between dietary transition itself and food loss and waste reduction. So food loss and waste reduction policies, they mostly benefit food loss and waste at the farm level stages, since there is a substantial plant-based losses kind of generated at this stage. At the same time, dietary transition, it decreases in farm level losses in mid and low income countries, but to a very low extent in high income countries, as consumption there shifts more towards plant-based foods and increases farm level losses. So essentially combining the two policies again, thus we do find this important kind of interactions. And finally, one aspect we also looked at is how does food loss and waste embodied in trade changes, right? Because in many cases, countries would import food, right? And food loss is generated in the exporting country, right? So we find that with healthy diets, higher demand for plant-based products, in some cases increasing food loss and waste embodied in export with stronger effects in sub-Saharan Africa. So we find some increases in food loss and waste exported from instance from China to US, from Latin America to US. So for instance, it's buying more berries, buying more fruits from Latin America, and then it does increase food loss and waste that is generated in Latin America itself. At the same time, food loss and waste policies themselves, they do result in substantial reduction in traded food loss and waste. And when we do combine both, we find that there are many spillovers that are kind of generated due to dietary transition itself are actually disappearing when we combine the two policies. So, for instance, we see that food loss and waste embodied in their vegetable, fruits, nuts exported from Latin America to US reduces by over 50%. So again, finding this important interaction. So to conclude, some key takeaways from our studies that I have just presented, we find that there is this important interaction between different policy layers. And if you consider just changing preferences alone, like dietary shifts, without changing some of the underlying technologies and kind of efficiency transformation along the supply chain, that might not be sufficient to really reduce the environmental footprints. So we find some commodities and stages where there are major spillovers from dietary transitions themselves, for instance, for oil seeds, fish in high-income countries, and increased food loss and waste embodied in exports from lower income to high-income regions. But at the same time, the combination of both strategy really does kind of eliminate those spillovers. We find also some kind of hotspots where specific technological solutions or policy interventions might be particularly beneficial to kind of support this transition. So, for instance, for lower income regions, we find that it would really be beneficial to combine dietary shifts with technological innovations to minimize the rising food loss and waste levels, particularly the production levels, where technologies are not yet, well developed, mature enough to kind of prevent that. And then in high income countries, we find that there would be particularly beneficial to focus on reusing plant-based agricultural losses, which can preserve the benefits of dietary shifts, but at the same time providing input for sustainable production. So think of like fertilizer or maybe energy produced from co-firing at the power plants. And then last final slide, I would like to discuss some key other areas of research we are working at and which might be also of interest for you. So first, there is still an open question of how the demand would evolve over time. As Dominique mentioned, it's a very complicated issue, especially when considered in the economy-wide framework. So understanding what would be the changes in preferences and across different food items, direct food consumption out of home, it's still kind of a very much evolving area of research. It's also, hard to predict how different policies would impact food demand. In many cases in our studies, we assume that there would be some shifts in preferences in terms of moving towards healthier diets, but understanding what policies might persuade that or help that move, that's something that we also currently working on with colleagues, particularly focusing on US, also trying to understand the impacts of some of the kind of currently evolving drugs and medications like GLP-1 arrays and so on. Also understanding the socioeconomic and distributional aspects of this transition. So far, we have been focusing at country level, national level, but what are the impacts across different types of households, particularly in developing countries? So we are linking, and for this type of analysis, usually one model won't be enough. So we are often linking this to more detailed, for instance, models with household level data, like microsimulation, global microsimulation models that have tens of millions of households to understand those. And then finally, improving parameterization of food loss and waste. So, for instance, what would be the cost of policies to reduce food loss and waste, right? So we are collaborating with colleagues from OECD who have developed abatement curves, trying to understand what investments are needed to reduce food loss and waste across different supply stages and commodities and so on. So there are quite a few, of course, areas for future research. And with this, I'll close the presentation. Thank you.
have for 10 minutes for Q&A and discussion. So you can make your question as brief as possible so we can accommodate many of them. That's right there.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My question pertains to the way you can simulate food loss and waste reductions through, I guess, the market-based mechanisms. And I just wanted to ask what those market-based mechanisms were, and if you have, or if you would hypothetically have them implemented at all the levels of the food production or at specific levels.
Thank you. We can answer each, and I'll go to the next one.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. So on food loss and waste, the way it is currently parameterized, we implement some technological improvements to achieve the reductions at different stages of the supply chain. The work we're currently kind of collaborating with OECD colleagues. So what they have developed is an abatement curve that provides you with an estimate how much you need to invest to reduce food loss and waste by a specific amount. So for instance, per ton, how much you need to invest in US dollars or euro to cut the waste. That is kind of a reduced form of presentation of various measures, which could include, improved waste collection and sorting, improved kind of infrastructure for waste processing, and a number of other measures. So essentially, the way we approach it, we try to come up with some bottom-up or, a set of technologies and then aggregate them into the one kind of representative cost measure that would capture it. So, yeah.
Yes. Next question.
Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I really appreciate it. When you're talking about the distributional impacts, I was kind of thinking of India in the 1970s with the Green Revolution and how it led to the increase of high yield varieties in the region, which is really great for mitigating food poverty and world hunger, but not so great for the health of the Indian people in the region, and are leading to diabetes and other issues because of the caloric difference in rice and barley and the other grains that were in the area originally. So I was wondering, when you're talking about distributional impacts, how do you ensure that when you're doing things like dietary transition, you're making sure that doesn't have a negative impact on the people and their local diets?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are always trade-offs, right? So when we estimate, any type of distributional impacts, either on income or, nutrition, diets, we would always find some trade-offs. So there would be parts of, either regions or, populations that would have improvements either in income or, quality of food, and there would be always some part of populations that would indeed experience negative implications. So the way we usually try to approach it is to identify these potential negative spillovers and then try to develop some policy measures or support measures that can help to alleviate those, right? For instance, this could be, cash transfers or specific domestic policies, local policies that would allow, for instance, households to improve their food access. So this kind of measures.
Okay. I'll ask a question. I went to a conference recently with a lot of big agribusiness and food companies. They were freaking out about these GLP-1 blockers, that for the first time, people who might actually eat less food, they really demand less food, especially in the Western Hemisphere. To what extent do you think that can be an issue, and how it can be modeled into this kind of scenarios?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. And we are actually currently working on one of the papers that trying to estimate the impacts from kind of GLP-1 arrays kind of adoption. Of course, there is still much uncertainty about that, right? So first, what's not clear is what would be the adoption rate, because now it's still a very low adoption rate, so less than 1%, even in US, even less in other countries. In terms of how that would impact food demand, there have been some kind of studies with kind of controlled trials and surveys. What they find is that in general, it reduces the overall food demand and demand like ultra-processed food in between kind of main meals, but the impacts on composition is still unclear. So potentially it might have important implications, but I think there is still major uncertainty on what would those implications would be. In addition, like a long-term health impacts and still, not well studied. So simply because we do not have enough data, so whether there would be any side effects for potential, related diseases or other aspects. So, but that's I think a very much evolving area of research.
Next question over there. Go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. My question was actually quite similar, but rather about vegetarian diets. There's been a lot of conversation about how vegetarian diet can help a lot with the greenhouse gas reductions and would help change the composition of our diets. But have you seen any trends and have you looked at the impacts of a vegetarian diet on waste and things like that?
Thank you. So actually, the diets that we are simulating, for instance, in the studies that I presented, it's very close to the vegetarian diet. So it does have some meat intakes, but for instance, so red meat is around less than 15 grams per day. And with this, we are finding when we implement this diet, we do find major reductions in emissions, particularly from methane and nitrous oxide. As Dominique presented, those are like a substantial share of agricultural emissions. And since emissions and livestock emissions are really hard to abate because there is not that much technology that would allow you to reduce substantial emission intensity. Like for instance, in the energy sector, you can substitute coal power generation with wind and solar and reduce emissions substantially. In case of livestock, there are some potential kind of measures that can reduce emissions, but relatively marginally. So the dietary issues that we have been considering really kind of like shows major reductions in emissions. And if kind of this would be even further refined to look into purely vegetarian diets, the impacts would be even more substantial.
More question with, it's just one more. Yes, please. Which question?
Have you, so I could be wrong, but it seemed like the dietary change was taken as kind of an exogenous change when you put it into the model. Have you incorporated it using like economic incentives or something like that to be a mechanism for the dietary change?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So in these studies that I presented, the dietary change was implemented as a behavioral shift, right? So we assume that consumers over 25 years gradually shift their behavior, change behavior, and change their demand patterns. Now, we know that food is very inelastic. So we did some other kind of studies where we looked into potential fiscal measures like taxes on less healthy foods like meat and subsidies to healthy foods like vegetables and fruits to see how that would impact the consumption behavior. And in general, what we have been finding is that even under rather high tax levels, 40, 50 and above %, and then recycling it as a subsidies, the consumption patterns have been changing like really slowly. So we have been moving 10% towards healthy diets. So the rest 90% has still been kind of like a gap that need to be closed. So in general, I think the area of understanding potential policy implementations that can help us to achieve the diet, in addition to just changing behavior, I think that's a very good point and important area for future research.
Anna, is there any questions from the online audience? All right, I think this will be a good point at which to close. Please help me thank our speakers. And